Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Supradeep Das, and I am a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. It is a matter of great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to all to another edition of the ICS Wednesday seminar titled The Chinese Community in India, Negotiating Mobility and Belonging. In contemporary understanding, the concept of diaspora includes not only those who were compelled to leave their homelands under adverse conditions, but also individuals who migrate voluntarily in pursuit of trade, employment, and other opportunities. The Chinese diaspora in India embodies a distinct blend of cultural heritage, economic mobility, and a sense of belonging. This seminar explores and examines the experiences of the Chinese diaspora in India. It also highlights the rich cultural heritage, economic activities, and dual identity as both Chinese and Indians. Special attention will be given to the impact of 1962 border dispute on their identity. The presentation will offer invaluable insights into diaspora studies and migration of dynamics. The speaker for today's seminar is Dr. Severin Kuok. She is a guest faculty at School of Global Affairs, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, New Delhi. She has many research publications in refereed journals, and she has been engaged in several translation projects, of which the most notable is the translation of short essays by one of China's most well-known women writers, Ping Xing, from Chinese into Hindi, titled Ping Xing Ki Rachnavali. Currently, she is engaged in translation of a popular collection of nearly 500 short stories titled Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio, Yao Chai Tree, from classical Chinese into Hindi. The chair for today's seminar is Dr. Ritu Agarwal, who is an associate professor at the Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her doctoral work explored the micro-level agrarian transformation in Yunnan province, and she is currently engaged in questions of provincial transformation, especially in Yunnan. Her research interests are rural political economy, urbanization, property rights, gender studies, and provincial and Chinese politics. Before I hand it over to the chair, I would like to request all the participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All the participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. Thank you. I shall now hand over to Dr. Agarwal. Over to you, Dr. Agarwal.
Thank you, Supradeep. I think we are now in a very important presentation today done by Professor Severin. I just have a couple of points to say. Diaspora community, especially Chinese diaspora community, is very unique in any ways because of its size and because of its long migration histories to all parts of world. And that is quite evident in terms of the China towns we get to see wherever we travel in most parts of the other countries, etc. And other interesting thing is that how these diaspora community in other countries are able to negotiate, as our speaker is going to speak today, especially in case of India, I guess, mobility and belonging. And by looking at the historical experiences and finding out, what are the whether they are able to feel accommodated in the country, or they are able to, make a kind of a space for themselves. So I think I won't take much time here, and I right away invite the speaker, who is also, trained in Chinese language, and I hope that she will also be dealing with this whole issue of, this Hua Ran and Hua Qiao. So what is the difference between overseas Chinese and the diaspora? So I'm sure that she will be able to, talk about this also in some part of her seminar. So welcome to Professor Severin, and over to you for your very interesting talk on Chinese community in India, negotiating mobility and belonging.
Thank you, Professor Agarwal. Thank you, Supradeep, for your kind introduction, and Professor Agarwal for introducing my topic. And I'd like to, at the outset, thank ICS for giving me this opportunity to speak about my PhD dissertation topic with this forum. And also, I am eternally grateful to ICS for having selected me for the ICS HYI scholarship, because of which, importantly, I could conduct my fieldwork in China and in the United States and Canada. So I'm like, without that scholarship, I don't think my work would have had reached its fruition the way I wanted it to. Of course, PhDs are never satisfactory to any scholar to their own for themselves. But I think the HYI scholarship did contribute, tremendously to my work. So I thank ICS for that. And before and not taking too much time, I'll start on my topic. So as has been introduced, my research has been on the Chinese community in India. So it's part of a diaspora, global diaspora, because Chinese have been traveling and settling down in all parts of the globe, and have set up diaspora communities everywhere. So there's a common saying that you'll always see a Chinese person and an Indian in every country of the world. So which is probably true. But my focus has been on a certain section of this diaspora community, which is the Chinese who selected India to make their home. And I'm also dealing with how their mobilities, not only to India from China in the first step of the creating a diaspora community, but their subsequent movement, which are called secondary movements to two places of settlement. One, going back to China, and two, going to a third country. So there's a secondary mobility, but there also is something called a return mobility involved in these secondary mobilities. So this study aims to spotlight this community and its history, to understand the effects, whether they are tangible or intangible, their migratory patterns since they have had since then, and that they have had on themselves and the society where they proceed to settle. The motivation behind this research is to employ the history of the Chinese community pre, during, and after the war of 1962, which acts as a vantage point and helps to analyze their mobility from India and questions their continued sense of connectivity and belonging, if any, despite these movements. The research aims to examine the intersectionality of the concepts of migration, identity, home, and belonging, while focusing on studying the Chinese community in India. It scrutinizes the historical pattern of the Chinese migration to India, the degrees and trends of assimilation that this community has had into the local scape, and the development of a distinct identity while residing in India for over 200 years. The conceptual approach which has been taken is an interdisciplinary one, because often scholars believe that the research in the field of migration is multifaceted and requires multiple prisms of analysis. So it is there are always questions as to the origins of migration, the direction of migration, and the continuity of migration flows, and the uses of migrant labor, and the socio-cultural adaptation of migrants. Although mid-range theories targeting one or two of these aspects have been the norm, devising a theory that can contend with all these four remains an ultimate goal in the migration theory. So Professor Agarwal has spoken about, who is Hua Qiao and who is Hua Ren. So I next will discuss about, how I have understood and examined this concept in my study. So it is very important to understand which group of Chinese am I talking about. Now, various scholars have always described, they have done work on the Chinese community. There have been certain Chinese scholars, Western scholars, and even some Indian scholars who have done certain levels of examining this community. And they've always talked about Chinese Indians or Indian Chinese. or they call them Chinese community in Calcutta, or Calcutta Chinese community, Hakka Chinese. Ellen Oxfeld, who has done a PhD on this topic, and she often calls this community as Hakka Chinese, because her focus has been on the Hakka community of Calcutta, not on all Chinese that reside in India. However, I examine this from Wang Gongwu's perspective, where he says, he is a noted historian and sinologist, who says that he does not believe that Hua Qiao, which is translated as overseas Chinese and often used as a term to describe the Chinese diaspora, is the correct term to address them. So his objection to this is predicated on the argument that the term refers to Chinese sojourners, Chinese subjects, or nationals temporarily residing abroad. So it's this Hua Qiao does not, because Qiao which means bridge. It is just that, these people are just bridging that gap between China and the country of their temporary residence for a very short period of time. But it doesn't really encompass the people who settle overseas for, almost permanently, sometimes almost permanently. So he believes that Hua Qiao is not the correct term to be used for Chinese diaspora community. So Wang finds it necessary to make a distinction between Hua Qiao and others who are foreign national of Chinese ethnicity residing in the adopted countries. So there's no one term universally accepted that could include both these categories of people. So one, who are temporarily residing in a foreign country outside of China, and two, the ones who are permanently residing in those countries. So Wang Gongwu uses a term called Chinese overseas instead, to refer to anyone who resides outside China. He rejects even the term Chinese diaspora, which is imbued with Jewish connotations, and thus he believes not suitable in this context. To specify the community which is under scrutiny in this work, that means anyone of ethnic Chinese descent. So I've excluded people who are of, say, Tibetan ethnicity, who are residing in India. So I'm only focusing on the Han Chinese who have Han ethnicity. And segueing from Wang Gongwu's usage of Chinese overseas, this term Chinese overseas, I name this community as Chinese Indians, because this is justified, because almost all of them have adopted Indian nationality and hold Indian passports in the current context. So they are in effect Indian citizens. So Chineseness is actually is a describer of their being Indian. So, and the few who still do not have Indian citizenship, it's not because of lack of wanting, but because of some other political and technical issues that they have in their application for Indian citizenship. And secondly, I believe that the term Chinese Indians is in consonance with the general practice exercised in the hyphenated labeling of people who have migrated to other countries, such as we have Indian Americans, Italian Americans, Greek Australians, Chinese Canadians, etc. Therefore, it is important to understand the scope of my who I am identifying here in this Chinese Indians. So I have examined this community in 3 sites, which geographically, which is primarily in Delhi, In Luliang, there's a Huaqiao Nungchang, which is the overseas Chinese overseas farm, which is in Luliang, which is in Yunnan province. And the third site of my exploration is based in Toronto, in Canada, where a majority of the Chinese community have migrated from India. So that is the people that these are the three groups of people that I discuss in my research. So in the first chapter that I discuss here is the historical part of the Chinese migration to India, how the community moved to India, how they settled, and the whole, the legendary stories of Wang Achiu coming in during Warren Hastings' time and settling around in Calcutta, going on horseback for a day and deciding which land was his, as has been spread in the various stories about the first Chinese settlement in India that took place way back in late 18th century. It is believed that he brought about 100 Chinese workers from China to settle down in India, and that was at the behest of the British government, which was in rule in India, in the imperial rule, because they wanted somebody who would probably, I mean, this is all conjecture. There are no historical, proof or records about, why Wang Achiu did actually come to India. There are various other legends also about the first Chinese who came to India. But Wang Achiu's story is one of the most well-known, and of course it has got some historical backing with the Achipur, that is a small town which is about 30 kilometers from Calcutta, which has been settled, and it is called Achipur, it is believed based on his name. So these people came, and mostly they were men, single men who did not bring their wives, women folk with them, nor their children, and initially settled down in India just to maybe earn a better living, because China during the 18th and the 19th century went through a lot of turmoil and war and hardships, because of which a lot of Chinese youngsters, young men, wanted to move out of China and find better pastures elsewhere in the world. And this is the time during the Qing dynasty when, after the Opium Wars, migration from China was even allowed, or, even encouraged by the imperial powers. So this is the time when actually fairly large waves, and when I say large, it's very, relative, because it's small in comparison to migratory trends to the West, say America or the Australia in the gold rush times. But it was fairly large in terms of current, or subsequent migration numbers to India. And so slowly, the men folk who settled down in India, they came as Huaqiao, they came as sojourners, with the idea that they would work and earn some better living, and take back some money back to their families back in China, which many did. But eventually, when they found that life in India was fairly good and not that difficult, because the British supported Chinese workers, and they found them skilled carpenters and skilled mechanics for their shipbuilding. So they found it lucrative and worthwhile. These people who, and most of them were not from very economically well-off families. They were mostly farmers, or from, they were all people who were looking for a better life elsewhere out of China. So after a few decades, when they realized that life in India is livable, and it's not so strange, or it's not so alien, so they slowly started to bring in their bring in their families. They either went back to China looking for partners, or some families back in China would send their future partners to India, and then they would get married and settle down in India. And then finally they did settle down and bring up their families here. And slowly the community increased, and Calcutta was the first port of call for most of these migrants who came. And then they started to move into other cities, maybe to Mumbai and Chennai and Delhi. And I have my own family. My father-in-law, I believe, came and he went to Lahore, as far as Lahore, and then moved to Kashmir and then back to Delhi. So everybody had their own road to travel on. So we had Chinese communities settling or being formed in these other cities, but normal understanding is that most people who in India who know about the Chinese community always believe it's in Calcutta, which is true. It is the largest community, and like Professor Agarwal mentioned, that we have Chinatowns all over the world. But in fact, Calcutta has two Chinatowns: one the Tangra Chinatown, and one the other, the Benting Street, the Tireta Bazaar Chinatown. So in fact, Calcutta is one of the few cities which has two. But this does not discount the fact that there are Chinese all over India, even in small towns like Machilipatnam and Ahmedabad. I mean, Ahmedabad is not a small city, but I'm just saying that even cities where one wouldn't think of there being a Chinese family, there are Chinese families. And of course, in the northeast, we have in Kalimpong, Siliguri, there were very established families who had very well run businesses in all kinds of trades. So they were settled there when they integrated with the local community. Some of them, like I said, they initially came as single men. So as single men, they probably had, and there are records of the fact, not probably, it's true that they had sometimes two families, one with an Indian wife and one back in China. But slowly, when they did finally bring their women folk here, they just had a single family. So that was the story right up till 62, and in the mid 20th century, again with the Japanese invasion in China, and again the hardships increasing with the Civil War, and of course the Second World War and the Japanese invasion, there was a larger inflow of Chinese ethnic Chinese people coming to India. Again, settling in and around Calcutta mostly. But and so the Chinese community grew and prospered, and they got into various trades such as and made a mark for themselves in trade like leather, in the leather and tannery business, the carpentry business, the laundry and the dry cleaning business. So each, and the peculiarity of Chinese trade was that usually people from a certain part of China would stick to a particular trade. Excuse me. So the Hakkas were well known for their leather and tannery expertise. The Cantonese, the other Cantonese, that is besides the Hakkas, of course, the Hakkas are also Cantonese in a geographically speaking, but the other Cantonese were good carpenters. They were into the laundry business. The Shanghainese were in the laundry business. The people from Shantung were in the trading business. They would come as traders and then maybe branch out in other trades as well. And finally, the Shanghainese and the Shantung people, they all moved into restaurant business. So these were the kind of jobs that they would engage in. And they did establish especially in the leather and tannery business, the Hakkas really had a very strong hold in the economy of the leather industry in centered in Calcutta, of course. So that this was their lifestyle, and of course they interacted with other communities, but they interacted with local communities as well. But as has been seen, and some of the scholars who have done previous work also, Chinese remained quite insular in that sense. You know, they would prefer to marry within the community. The men, of course, could have maybe a local wife, but the women were always expected to, it's the typical patriarchal mindset that there is, that the women always needed to marry within the Chinese community, and that the Tangra community itself shows a kind of insular behavior, very visual insular behavior, where the old factory walls were high, and they wouldn't allow, it was like a little fortress where outsiders were not allowed to enter. And of course now everything has changed, but right after the 1960s, it was, houses are built in the very Chinese fashion in the courtyard, and within the courtyard there was factories, and and their living quarters, everything was settled within that walled kind of area. In other cities like Delhi and all, whether the community was much smaller in number, people did not have the community did not have the advantage of this, being together all the time with co-ethnics, or living in this very protected sort of area. Everybody had to take care of themselves, and they were all spread out all over the city. So it was a different kind of socio-economic kind of setup in cities other than Calcutta. Right up to this was, so Chinese developed a fairly well economic base for themselves, however insular that it was. They were endogamous, they believed in endogamy. They did not like having interracial marriages within the community. It was looked down upon. So this was right up to 1962. And I consider 62 as the kind of watershed moment for the community, because that kind of questioned the identity of, and the belonging, and their status, the community status within India, where they felt they had been feeling quite comfortable setting up businesses, bringing up families, their children, and getting maybe more acculturated and assimilated into the local community. 62 brought into focus how different they were, because the physiology of their own physiology made them stand out. You could easily point out to a Chinese in a crowd, and the hostility, the border hostility, brought their I find this very difficult to even articulate, but it brought out their loyalties to India, which I believe is quite absurd, because people who, they were not even politically, they were not into politics. They were just ordinary people who were living their lives, going about their businesses. Anyways, their loyalty to India was brought into question. They were called spies. And then a large number overnight, from December 1962, when the war had virtually ended, they were rounded up, taken to a camp, mostly rounded up from areas in Calcutta, around Calcutta, northeast, Siliguri, Kalimpong, Assam, put into trains, and closed trains, not like a local regular passenger train. They were literally like a goods train, no windows, no doors, and they were packed off, around 2,000 of them, and sent to a small village in Rajasthan called Dioli. Dioli used to be an POW camp right up till then. In the Second World War, it was acted as a POW camp for Italian and German soldiers. And prior to that, it was a prison camp for Indian freedom fighters. So it was literally a camp, but literally a prison, but it was treated as an internment camp for the Chinese in '62 and thereafter. So these families, about around 2,000 plus from the eastern areas, and then others from Delhi, from Bombay, from other parts of the country, were rounded up. And if somebody asked, like, why not all the Chinese people? Well, not all Chinese people were rounded up. There were about 50,000 odd ethnic Chinese people living in India at that point, according to some estimates. These are not recorded estimates. The Chinese never, they are never recorded as in the censuses or anything like that. These are just rough estimates. So anyways, they were rounded up, and about 3,000 plus were put into these internment camps in Deoli. And from December 1962 right up till middle of 1967, that means about 5 years, people were incarcerated in these camps. And these were not men, these were women, these were children. Some children were actually born in this camp. There is a lady called Monica Liu. She was born in the camp after about a couple of months. Her mother was arrested and sent to this camp, and while she was pregnant, and gave birth to Monica in the camp. So they stayed in these barrack-like structures which were built in this camp, and this was, like I mentioned earlier, it was till 1967. However, in 1963, from March onwards, the Chinese government dispatched one ship which took 3 voyages. It was called the Guanghua. And because China had this policy, not only for the Indian internees, but it had been having this policy for the overseas, returnees, what they call returnees, and they wanted the squeechiao, that means who are returning back to China, because there's a problem for them to live in the country of their movement, like in most of the Southeast Asian countries, like Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, even Thailand and Vietnam, Philippines. People who had lived there for 300-400 years were finding it hard during the 1960s, 1950s onwards. They were finding it hard. The Chinese community were very affluent in these countries, and local ethnics were finding it hard to digest the fact that the Chinese controlled the economies of these countries. So there was a lot of hostility against the Chinese ethnics in these countries, and the Chinese government, the communist government, believed that such people of Chinese ethnicity should be protected and should be brought back to the motherland, where they could live a safer and safer life. So in the same vein, the Chinese government sent this ship, the Guanghua, to Chennai, the Madras on those days, 3 times, in March, in May, and then the last voyage was in July. And it took back most of these internees who were in Deoli, and most of them were actually deported. They were given deportation orders by the government of India because they were considered to be anti-nationals and danger to the national security of India. So, which included women and children, of course. And in these 3 voyages, about 2,000 odd people took the choice. They didn't really have a choice. They were giving marching orders, and they had to take the ship back to China. they were not, most of them were not allowed to go back to their cities of where they lived, like Calcutta or Kalimpong or Siliguri. They were not allowed to collect any personal belongings. Some of them were directly put onto trains from Deoli and sent to Madras, where they had to board the ship. Some of them, of course, I don't know what reason was there for such discrimination, but some were allowed to go back to their homes and collect some personal items that they could, or collect some money that they can take back to China. But most of them were not allowed that. Now, within this returnee migration that took place, there was, of course, this was involuntary that I'm talking about. They were forced to go back to China. But there was a certain group of people, even among these, who voluntarily decided to go back to China, because the environment in India for them had just become untenable, and going back to China was probably the only option left to survive. So I know of certain families who decided to, the entire family went back to China, took the voluntary decision to go back to China within this, during these voyages, because it was free, and they were in such dire economic conditions that they thought that if they didn't take that option of going back in this trip, then maybe in future, when things became even more difficult, they wouldn't be able to afford to go back. So they did decide to go back voluntarily. So this talks about the voluntary, I talk about the voluntary and involuntary return migration. So what brings into focus here is the question of, I went back to Luliang in Yunnan, where they were settled in these overseas Chinese farms, about 2,000 of them. In various other farms also, Luliang was one of the ones where the largest numbers went to. And they had to rebuild their lives there, because most of them didn't speak Putonghua. They didn't know how to read or write Chinese, definitely, because they had been born and brought up in India. So it was a learning of the skills, a relearning of language. They were, they had to go through 6 years of learning how to speak Chinese, read and write Chinese. And this was the time in 62, 63, right after 2 or 3 years, China went into this huge chaos of the Cultural Revolution. And they had to, they had been brought up in a democratic country like India, and, to go into this kind of chaotic situation was completely, culturally and politically alien for these people. So anyways, they had to undergo all the changes that their lives had taken. And in Luliang, I met this family, which actually was very, very fascinating for me, and which really questioned the idea of, who is Indian, who is Chinese, who is Indian Chinese, or Chinese Indian. It was completely, just amazing. So this family is, grandmother was Assamese, grandfather was Chinese, had a son who has 5 children himself. His wife was also Assamese. And the children now, who are about in their 50s, they look completely Assamese. When I met this lady who was living there in Luliang, she looks just like a Assamese lady, but when she speaks like a local. And she's been born and brought up in China. And but the physiology, like I said, it's completely out of place. So it was just fascinating for me. And she's never been to India. She's hardly ever interacted with people except her mother, who was also deported during the 1962. Her father, her mother, and she wasn't born that time. Her parents were deported, and that's how she was born in Luliang. Her brother, also her younger brother, he's been named, she is called, and I forget her name. Her brother is being called Dara Singh. And they've never been to India, but they watch Indian films. They're very fascinated by the Indian culture because their mother, and they speak Bengali or Assamese, sorry, I apologize there. They speak Assamese because I was surprised. I said, how do you speak Assamese? Because she said, my mother, she said, if you want to speak Chinese, you speak Chinese outside the home. But once you enter the home, you speak Assamese. And her mother continued to wear a sari till she died. So I don't know where she managed to get her saris, but she said her mother always wore saris as much as she could remember. So this was what I encountered, and the question of belonging and the emotional relationship of belonging that one has to different cultures and different geographies could be overarching actual being born in that country. So this was the story of one of them. And so I move on to the last part of my research, which is the secondary migration of the Chinese Indians to Toronto in Canada. Of course, Chinese, and after 62, like I said, it is the watershed point. So after the deportations and when the community realized that things were not that comfortable or may not be comfortable in the future, a lot of businesses had to close down. A lot of the schools that the community had opened for their children closed down. A lot of their small newspapers, which they were publishing local news in the Chinese language, closed down. So everything was becoming very difficult for them. And they realized that obviously the majority were not deported, and but things were very difficult. Life was becoming harder. So, and this was in the 60s, where there was a general global migratory trend which was evolving all over the world. We were moving, the world was moving to a more globalized world. So movement was becoming more easy, and options to move into other foreign countries were being opened up for the Chinese as well. So with the first few people who moved to the West, slowly they started to, call in their kin, which were in India. So many moved to Australia and to Canada, to the United States, even to Europe. But the largest community that we see, especially from India, is in Toronto. And there is actually a very interesting culturally they have even encouraged the Indian Chinese cuisine in Toronto, because as you know, there's a large Indian community as well, and they want not the true Chinese cuisine, they want the Indianized Chinese cuisine. So we have a lot of restaurants in Toronto which says Indian Chinese and not just Chinese cuisine. So this community slowly started evolving in Toronto, and how they moved, whether it was just wanting to open a business, through study, for education. Slowly families started to move out of India, and there was a large exodus over the 60s and 70s, and depleting the numbers in Calcutta. So actually in Calcutta now there is a there's a fraction of the community that actually lived there in the 50s and 60s, which remain. But the interesting part is that the families have left behind, like I said, they were running very, very lucrative leather and tanning businesses, and they did not want to stop that. or they had branched out in the restaurant or any other or the other businesses like beauty parlors. They kept their 1 foot. So if it was a large family, they always kept one of the siblings back in India who would take care of the business, and the rest of the family migrated to Toronto. So, I have examined how the Chinese Indian, now the Chinese Indian Canadian. So this hyphenated identity has evolved, and this leads to, and they have maintained some transnational linkages with India, because they still come back to India every year, because they believe they come back during Chinese New Year, and they believe the Chinese New Year, the way it is celebrated in Calcutta, cannot be celebrated anywhere else in the world. So they do come back to Calcutta every year religiously to be part of that celebration. Well, up till a few years ago, people would come to India during this period, because this was also the, right time to look for partners for their children, because they didn't want their children to marry a westernized person from, say, Canada. So they would look for their suitable partners back in India, which born and brought up with, in India, with the similar values and similar cultural background. So that was also, the Chinese in Calcutta, there used to be like a marriage market during the Chinese New Year celebrations. Of course, now with this maybe second and third generation younger people do not believe in this arranged marriage system anymore. So it's kind of dying down, but there are still families who do come back to look for suitable partners for their children or their siblings. So all this leads me, and I think it's time for me to conclude now. So I believe that all these movements of the Chinese community has led to a transnational identity, a multi-hyphenated identity, and belonging does not remain to one person or one place or to your ethnicity. It also relates to where you were born, what kind of where you were brought up, and because the people who return back to China still think of India as their home, and still think of cooking curry till today, even though they have not lived in India for the last 60, 70 odd years. People in Canada still come back to India because they want a good, suitable partner for their children. And they feel that this is the culture which they have grown up with, and they feel connected to that. So that was the whole purpose of my work, is to show that how belonging can surpass political identity, and it does not necessarily need to question loyalties of a person, or the political loyalties of a person, and it can surpass and create cultural bonds which go over these narrow understandings of belonging. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Ritu sent a message to unmute her. There she is.
Thank you.
You're okay now. Yes.
Well, I was also, I think Severin has actually, spoke very nicely, and gave us a lot of questions to think about, that how this, even after transnational migration, this search for home, or search for a kind of a belonging, bringing Chinese communities back to India, no matter wherever they travel. And you not only the Chinese Indian curry, but I would say sometime Indian weddings, sometime Indians culture, as she's saying, the costume, etc., is still popular among the Chinese communities, no matter wherever they go. So these are some of the interesting and very complex issues that she has raised, that why the Chinese community in India becomes so unique in terms of searching for belonging and identity. So what should we do now? Should we take questions from the floor and, you know, or maybe I start with a couple of questions, then she can answer, and then uh, in meanwhile we give some time for the audience to raise questions. So maybe Sabrine, till the time they come up with the questions, I would say, because have you at any point of time also looked into this whole issue of, how this Chinese communities when they're traveling to other parts of Asia? So what have been their experiences? I mean, I'm just asking, for the, if you have also looked into some of those aspects that, what is it which makes them different from India and other countries in Asia? I mean, you can think about it, but I think we have a question here. So we begin with the question first. Yes, Supradeep.
Yes, Dr. Agarwal. The question is from Lin Fengwen. So her question is, Dear Dr. Kuok, thank you for giving us a comprehensive overview of the history of Chinese communities migrating to India. I wonder if you could shed some lights on research on the Chinese community migrating to India after the 2000s.
So we take up this first and
Okay.
yeah, Sabrine.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Agarwal. Actually, I have read quite a bit about the community. I'll answer your question. The small question that you raised about other Chinese communities in other part of East Asia and Southeast Asia. I have read a lot of work on the communities in Southeast Asia, and especially one book written by Chinese scholars in Chinese about the policies of the Chinese government to deal with the problems, like I mentioned, that the Chinese communities were facing in countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, the hostilities that we were facing. So I have obviously not done a very extensive reading, but obviously connected reading, how because of the policies that, to understand the policies of the Chinese government in dealing with these, the Huaqiao and setting up the Huaqiao Nongchang in China. How they were settled up, how they decided to create these communities within, that is another thing. I'm sorry, I couldn't really focus on that, how the Huaqiao Nongchang was set up and how the policies of those Huaqiao Nongchangs were evolved over a period of time. The Chinese government initially, because they allowed the Chinese ethnics to come back to China, but later in the early 50s and 60s, because they felt that the motherland is the place where they would be safe. But eventually when, with the I think the communist government, matured, they suddenly turned their policies into pushing the Chinese ethnics into actually accepting their local culture. So lots of people in Thailand, you can see the Chinese in Thailand have actually taken on Thai surnames. They do not have Chinese surnames anymore, or even in Indonesia. So the government actually encouraged the Chinese ethnics to amalgamate and to acculturate to the local community and the local culture. So this was their policy, and that's how they pushed. Of course, if things became absolutely untenable, they always had the policy that, and they still have that policy that China will always accept their ethnics back home in case of extreme difficulties and hostilities. So that's the I hope that answers your question. I haven't done like too much in-depth info. Of course, that would be an interesting channel of research, channel to look into research for and compare, the Indian experience with the experiences in other countries. I hope
We
that
had the
answers.
question. Yeah. That
Yeah.
perfectly
And of
fine.
course, the question that Lin Feng Wan has raised is that if I have done any work on the Chinese community migrating, well, I don't think there is any Chinese community actually migrating to India. When I don't understand if migration, by migration she means permanently settling in India. I do not believe there is any permanent settlement of Chinese after the 60s. There's been a complete full stop to that. Of course, we have a large Huaqiao community, which is businessmen, students who are coming to India to set up businesses and be liaison for many businesses, and of course students, and there is an interesting pattern that I have seen over the years, and again I would love to do some work on that area, is that a lot of not a lot but a fair number of Chinese women who are married to Indian men and have settled down in India. There is a small community of such women, and they are raising their families in India in an Indian setting, and how they have been accepted into Indian families, and whether they met their husbands in China or in a third country where they were met as students or fell in love somewhere, but they've all come and settled down in India, and they're living their lives in India and what their experiences have been. So I don't know if that answers that question, but I do not believe that there is any permanent settlement besides these women who are married to Indian men. I don't think there are any individual permanent Chinese people settling in India as Indian citizens. What's the next question? I'm sorry, it's going too fast.
Yeah, the next question is from Siddharth Than. So he asked about what were the occupations of the Deoliwalas, were the journalists, businessmen, and what businesses were targeted at that time?
Okay, that's a good question. There was no occupation that particularly that was taken into. If you look at the demographics of the people who were the Deoliwalas, which they call themselves now, if people who don't understand this, so all the people who are interned in Deoli call themselves Deoliwalas now. Like I said, they were restaurant owners, they were businessmen, they may have been journalists, they may have been teachers in the Chinese schools which were running in Calcutta. But there were women and children also. So there was no specific occupation that was being targeted here. It was just random. So I can't say there was any particular business that was being targeted.
So the next question is from Monica Kumari. She is asking about, could you please shed some light on the demographic statistics of Chinese diaspora in India, especially after the post-COVID moment?
Again, the Chinese community, I divide into two groups. One is people who've been here for the last, since the late 18th century and their descendants. And the other Chinese community is the one which I just spoke about, who are students, businessmen, and affiliates who have come to India in the recent past, in the recent decades, to do business here or to do work in India. So my study does not focus on the Huaqiao, who are still Chinese citizens. They just come and live in India temporarily. So they are the Huaqiao, according to the definition. I'm talking about the Huaran or Huai, who are Indian citizens, but of Chinese ethnicity. So their demographic has always been declining, and the numbers are, people are just slowly but steadily moving out of India. But I don't see any politics involved here anymore. Of course, in the 60s, late 60s and early 70s, the war was the backdrop, and people are still sensitive about talking about the war. And if people have experienced, if their families have experienced any of the early experiences, then there is obviously this topic is very sensitive to people in the community. But I think the people who are moving out, the younger generation which is moving out, is not connected to that war history. And they are just moving as part of the global migratory trends that we see, that, if there is better uh, future abroad, or better lifestyle abroad, then they want to migrate. And of course, since a lot of their old family, the older generation is already settled in countries like the West, in like Toronto or in the United States, then they have the options of going abroad in an easier way than for others. I think Monica asked about the post-COVID. I don't think COVID has really played much of a role. COVID's been to the community as it has been to everybody else.
The next question is from Chor Si San. His question is about his part of the research is about food practices of migrants from southern China to Kolkata. Could you share more about what kinds of food that they cook to express their sense of belonging? That you have mentioned in the presentation that a family cooked curry in China, and Indian Chinese restaurants are very famous in the Toronto. Do you find any differences in their food practices across the 3 different field sites?
Again, a very, very interesting question. Food is such an integral part of not only, any, most of the old cultures, food is such an integral part of Chinese culture. So historically, when I said Chinese community in Calcutta was very insulated, food was one of the indicators of that insulation. People in Tangra, or they would not, the physical, the geographical and the visual insulation reflected in their food culture also. I have met people from Calcutta who say that we only eat Chinese food, the Hakka Chinese food. We do not like Indian food. This was during when I was younger, when I was a small child. And they would take pride on the fact, they would look down on people who liked, say, Golgappe or Chole Bhature. I grew up in Delhi and I was very, open to, I always experienced, I love having these foods. And somehow I always got this sense that, somehow I lost my cultural identity because I like Indian food. Which I found very offensive. So anyway, so she asked, what kind of foods that they cook. So there are people from Calcutta who say that they would like to only cook Hakka style food at home, which they do, of course. Now, this was the older generation. Now the newer generation is, of course, more open to the ideas, and they work in other fields besides working only in Tangra or in Yadareta Bazaar. They are working in all kinds of fields. So they are exposed. I'm talking about people who are living in India still. They're exposed to so many, to all kinds of Indian culture. They cannot be insulated anymore. I never felt I was insulated because I grew up in Delhi and I did not grow up in that Tangra sort of atmosphere. Now people are more open to openly saying, it was kind of not acceptable to say that you liked anything else besides Chinese food. The true Chinese food, not the localized, the Indian Chinese food. So talking about the families who cooked Indian food in China who returned to China. Yes, they still do. They in fact yearn to get that flavor of garam masala and curry. I ate supposed curry in one of their houses. Of course, it didn't taste like anything like curry because they don't have access to the masalas that we have. But they think that's curry. For them, it's a memory of home, just having put some cinnamon put into it or some cloves, which are, of course, available in China. But they think, okay, and they have some friends who have moved on from the overseas farms to Hong Kong and other countries. They often request them, could you please send up some, curry masala from those countries so that we can cook curry. So they still remember India through the food experience. And yes, there are the food differences in food practices. People in Toronto also, they love to still eat the Indian food. So they might not have accepted it while living in India, but when they go to Toronto, they want to remember India through their food.
Yeah, then Siddhartha actually answered some of the Lin Fengwei's question, that is almost impossible to become Indian citizens for Chinese after 62 because they required special permission at the highest level.
Yes, correct.
About the post 2000s. Then we have a question from Monica Sharma. Her question is, can you please shed some light on the impression and reaction of the Chinese people in India to visit of Chinese leaders such as Kang Youwei or Chiang Kai-shek?
Okay. Yeah, so I haven't read too much about people's reactions to Kang Youwei, but definitely to Chiang Kai-shek. When he came in 1960, the Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai slogan was coined. And the Chinese community, especially in Delhi, because that's where he landed, were all asked to go to the airport to give him a welcome, a physical welcome. And in fact, this led to many of them who went and were photographed with him or in the procession, because they lined the streets and waved flags and to give him that popular welcome. They were the ones who actually got targeted for the arrests and for the internment in Deoli, because they were when the police was asked to round up some Chinese, who would they do it? They'd say, okay, that person was seen publicly there waving a Chinese flag, let's catch him. So that's what happened. And so it's a good question to ask, that that's what led to their arrest, actually. Even though they went very innocently, because they were asked to go and because that when Chiang Kai-shek came to oh, sorry, this is Chiang Kai-shek, I'm sorry, we're talking about no, I don't know about Chiang Kai-shek. I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted here. Kang Youwei and Chiang Kai-shek, no, I don't know about their reactions, because Chiang Kai-shek and there was a bifurcation in the community in Calcutta, especially on the politics of China, because there was a communist CPC leaning faction, and then there was the the Taiwan leaning faction. So that also led to a lot of stresses in the community and a lot of how should you put it, backbiting and somebody spying on somebody else, or complaining about somebody else that he's a communist and he's not from the so there was a lot of that kind of activity also happening during the 62 war. Sorry, my story was going off onto a tangent somewhere else. Sorry about that.
Then we have a question from Professor Madhavi Thampi. She asks that did some of the Chinese who migrated to India come from Southeast Asia as well, in which case there would be a case or another layer of identity?
The only reading that I have, I read one reading that there was some people who were the dentist came from Malaysia or Southeast Asia via these countries. Of course, they were originally from Hubei in China. But their experience, I mean, they traveled through the Southeast Asian countries to eventually land up in India. So yes, I have read some readings on this, but the others I do not think so, because I think most of the ships left from the eastern coasts of China and landed up in Calcutta. Of course, they would be passing through Southeast Asia, no doubt. But I think they all were targeting to land up in Calcutta, because once one person was settled in Calcutta, they would often bring their their friends or their families back from home to settle with them and increase their businesses or whatever. The National Archives has records of this. People. I have seen. The partners who were selected for certain people, their records of their entries in the National Archives, and when they entered, and they came, why? Because the reason is given as fiancé to Mr. So and so. That I have seen. So that is probably showing that they came directly from China and not. Besides the Hubei experience, I have not read about any other groups coming via the Southeast Asian way. If there are, I would like to read about that too.
So we don't have any questions for now.
Yeah, I think so. Everybody agrees with me that we have actually had a wonderful session of a lot of questions, answer, and engagement. So, director, if director wants to come in for something, I think we should also thank ICS to bring up this kind of a theme, so that there could be some engaging issues to be discussed at this forum. If there's nothing else to go forward, I was just remembering, about Indian tea. I'm sure Severin also must have seen that, the movies. So Indian movies and Indian tea, which is still popular in China. So our first trip, and I'm sure here many people will also share with that. Avara who used to very popular, a kind of a, and then also Indian tea. So there was a kind of a lot of puzzle that how Indians make tea with lot of milk. So which is very different from the tea, and still you takes a lot of time to explain people that how teas are different, though it came from China, but the way it has been made here is so differently done. So I think if should we conclude by thanking the speaker, by raising a lot of interesting and engaging issues to carry forward further. And I think it's a very whole lot of identity, belonging, and a look for space. The kind of agency of diaspora community, the way they are negotiating this sense of identity and belonging, which is very much came out, very fascinating way and very picturesque way that that you presented, talk about the interviews you have taken, the families you met, and the life histories of those communities. So we look forward to your work further. If you're carrying forward in other countries or India as well. So with that, I really thank the director as well as the speaker for bringing such an important issues at this forum. So over to you, Siddharth. Sorry. Over to you, Supradeep. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Chair. Now I seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session.
Yes, please.
So with this, we come to an end of today's discussion. We thank Dr. Ritu Agarwal and Dr. Severin Kuok for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. The video of today's discussion will be present on the ICS YouTube channel. We also like to invite you on the upcoming Wednesday seminar scheduled for 18 December 2024. Further information regarding the event can be found on ICS website. You may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you for joining us today, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks, everyone. Really,
Thank you,
really,
everybody. I see a couple of people have written to me if they want to get in touch with me. Please, anybody that you're most welcome. I would love to have discussions with you if I can help you in with your research or in any other way in my small, contribution, I'll definitely be happy to do that. So my contact details, I suppose you can get from ICS.
Maybe somebody can just put it up in that chat box, and people can just take it from there.
If my phone number, because I'll be available on WhatsApp only now, because I'm not in India right now. So I'm only available on WhatsApp and email, of course. So if that can be shared with people, that'd be great.
Yeah. So that can be done. Thanks. It was really
thank you so
very
much,
interesting.
everybody, for listening.
No, very, very refreshing, and something that we don't often hear about or think about. In fact, I will be putting you in touch with one of my students who's working on Chinese diaspora in the US. And I think she will find it very useful to get your insights in the matter.
Yeah, this was like, I wanted a subaltern, perspective, rather than, always this big country, big power dialogue that we constantly have.
Yes. Thanks.